All right. So I want to talk about the challenge of Buddhism. The principle of the oneness of religion is undoubtedly at the core of the Baha'i faith, intimately linked with the oneness of God and the oneness of humanity. It's a fairly straightforward matter to see this same principle within the other religions of the Abrahamic tradition, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There are two main reasons for this. First, the closeness of the religion's teachings with one another, especially when considering the religious background of the Baha'i faith. And second, there is a great deal of guidance concerning such comparisons within the Baha'i writings themselves. The situation becomes trickier, though, when one directs one's gaze to other religious traditions of the world. There is much less guidance about these traditions in the Baha'i writings, and the dissimilarities with the Abrahamic tradition become greater. Mujan Momen argues that Buddhism presents perhaps the greatest challenge to the Baha'i principle of the oneness of religion. So let me pull up my readings here. Okay, so I guess I'm going to start at the beginning here. I see Margaret is our first person on the list. Would you mind reading number 1 for me?
Perfect. Reading 1. Buddhism is, in a sense, the paradigmatic model of religion which is far removed from the Abrahamic tradition and about which there is very little in the Baha'i scriptures to provide guidance. Many of the concepts in Buddhism appear to be very hard to reconcile with the teachings of the Abrahamic religions. Therefore, it's often stated that the case of Buddhism presents special problems for the Baha'i concept of the unity of religion. And this is Mojan Momen, the Baha'i approach to other religions, the example of Buddhism.
Okay, thank you. So some of the concepts that Buddhism does not include, which are common to the Judeo-Christian Islamic religions, are, and get this, beliefs in God, the prophets, a holy book, sacred law, and the individual self, among others. So rather than trying to present the Baha'i faith in such a way as to take account of Buddhist attitudes and the Buddhist view of the world, Baha'is often attempt to reformulate Buddhism in a manner conformable to the Baha'i faith, or rather to the Western conceptualization of the Baha'i faith that is accepted as the norm. Surprisingly, Momen admits to being guilty of employing this very strategy himself in his 1995 book, Buddhism and the Baha'i Faith. There he tried to find a God within Buddhism in order to recast the religion with all the trappings of Western religion, a prophet, a holy book, prophecies, etc. He later came to understand the limitations of such a Baha'i-centric method. Okie dokie, and so maybe Leslie is our next reader. 2.
When Baha'is are challenged with the fact that this is not how Buddhists see their own religion, the usual response is that the original teachings of the Buddha is sympathetic to a viewpoint that says the whole basis of their religious belief is false, and the civilization in which they have erected over the past 2,500 years, and the writings of all of their most respected saints and scholars have been founded on error.
Think about that. Oh, yeah. You wouldn't get very far with a Buddhist if you were to say that. You really wouldn't. They'd dismiss you out of hand. So if it is to succeed, the presentation of the Baha'i faith must harmonize to some extent with the Buddhist worldview. If we're to engage in a mutually respectful form of communication, Baha'is must be careful not to dialogue at a superficial level, but rather demonstrate a deeper understanding of this religion. So this will entail our becoming familiar with at least the following characteristics of Buddhism: Gautama Buddha's main teachings, the path to overcoming suffering, historical development of Buddhism, key figures and personalities, similarities and differences between the southern, eastern, and northern branches of Buddhism, and the three so-called turnings of Buddhism. Well, that's just a sort of high-level overview of the territory we're going to cover in the next, I don't know, 8 months or so. I don't know how long it's going to take, but it's not 4 or 5 weeks, I don't think. So I want to talk about Baha'i hermeneutical principles. Hermeneutics is a fancy way to say interpretation. Before we acquaint ourselves with these characteristics of Buddhism, it's important to have a clear idea how to interpret them based on a solid Baha'i foundation. To my knowledge, only 2 Baha'i scholars have analyzed the Baha'i sacred writings in an effort to uncover the hermeneutical principles implemented by Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha. In the late 1980s, Dan J. May published his findings in an article called A Preliminary Survey of Hermeneutical Principles Found Within the Baha'i Writings in the Journal of Baha'i Studies, Volume 1, Number 3 in 1989. So I just want to switch over here to this. As you can see, he had identified 8 of them. So, religious texts contain multiple meanings. The symbolic and mythological character of religious language, the role of science and religion in the interpretive process, the progressive and relative nature of religious truth, the twofold nature of religion, essential and non-essential, the problem of personal biases and presuppositions, the independent investigation of truth, and interpretive moderation. So some of those are quite clear, I think, right off the bat from your reading in other sources. In some cases, you may have to go back to this particular document to read what he means by some of these. 20 years later, Mujan Momin scrutinized the text of Baha'u'llah's Book of Certitude, the Kitab-i Khan, searching for the hermeneutical principles which might guide the Baha'i interpretation of non-Abrahamic religious traditions. Altering the approach he had taken in Buddhism and the Baha'i faith in 1995, he attempted to break out of a Baha'i-centric method in his 2003 article in the Baha'i Faith and the World's Religions, papers presented at the Irfan Colloquia, which he edited for George Ronald Publications. Now, I have to switch over here, and we need to have, how about David Erickson for this, number 3?
There we go.
Okay, all right. Number 3, for this paper, I have looked at the way that Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha tackled the interpretation of the scriptures of other religions, mainly the Bible and the Quran, and tried to abstract from this the principles that they have used. I have then tried to apply these principles to religions that are not specifically addressed in the Baha'i scriptures, taking Buddhism as the example. Mujan Momin, the Baha'i approach to other religions.
So let me switch back over to this. 3 of his findings went beyond Dan May's discoveries. First of all, there's the acceptance of the station of the founder of all the religions. Secondly, the scriptures of religions other than Islam, Babism, and the Baha'i faith are not pure, unadulterated text. They are not authenticated in the way that those 3 religions are. Okay, let's just take a look at one of the points he makes about that. Number 4, I think it's going to be Belinda, please.
Sorry, Belinda, I muted you. Pardon me. You'll have to unmute yourself, Belinda.
Reading
There she
number
is.
4. The text of the scriptures of other religions except Islam are not the exact words given by the founders of those religions, because the process of oral transmission through several or many generations before those texts were written down necessarily involves some loss of accuracy. Nevertheless, the scriptures are an accurate reflection of the message of the founders of these religions. They are a source of true guidance. They have retained their salvific,
Salvific.
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 their salvational
Yeah, salvational. That's the same idea. Why did we choose that tough word to say? Okay, so just to make it clear, this isn't just about Judaism, but it's also about Christianity, for instance. We don't have the unadulterated text of what Jesus actually said. Scholars have tried and tried and tried to determine which of the sayings in the New Testament are actually his words. They've pretty well decided that it's all the I statements there. I don't know how many there are, maybe 30 or something. But the jury's still out on as to whether those are actually authentic. We really don't know. But do we dismiss their salvific efficacy? No. So the same is holding true to Buddhism. And the third point that Momen makes is it would be a gross injustice to God to say that the scriptures of a religion have been completely lost or irretrievably corrupted. And that's this fifth point. Is Alan on now, Linda?
Yes, Alan's here.
Oh, great. I didn't
Sure.
see him come in. He's on.
Okay. When the manifestation departs, only the scriptures are left to continue the teachings and guidance that the manifestation brought. God would not remove from the people the only source of guidance that they had left. Mujan Momen, the Bahai approach to other religions.
Okay. So it may be not a rock solid foundation to work from, but I think it's a good good place for us to start when we look at Buddhism. Okay, so go back to what he said, the acceptance of the station of the founder. Okay, so Buddha is a manifestation of God, pure and simple, stated very clearly. They're not pure unadulterated text, but that doesn't mean that we have to dismiss them. And they're not corrupted. Because why would God go to all the trouble of having a manifestation of God, in the Buddhist case, have all these many dialogues for 45 years, many of which people were paying attention to, and they had exceptional memories in those days. And then eventually it was committed to paper. So we can't dismiss those as well. Okay, so with these principles in mind, let's look at the birth and early development of Buddhism for the rest of the evening. As you may know already, Indian culture has not been as concerned with recording precise dates as has Chinese or Greco-Roman cultures. So dates cannot always be arrived at with accuracy. All sources agree that Gautama was 80 when he died. Pali sources of Theravada Buddhism say that this occurred 218 years before the inauguration of the Buddhist emperor Ashoka. Richard Gombrich, who is a highly respected Buddhist scholar, considers the Buddha's birth and death dates to be 484 before the Common Era and 404 before the Common Era when he died. These are the most likely given the current state of our knowledge at the moment. So the Pali Canon is the standard collection of scriptures in the Theravada Buddhist tradition, which was preserved in the Pali language. It's the most complete canon of early Buddhism in existence. It's called the Tripitaka, as it contains 3 pitakas, which is a word for baskets. 3 pitakas of teachings. Together, they comprise 32 volumes. Well, let's just see here. So the 3 baskets are the basket of discipline. This is for the monks and nuns, particularly. The basket of discourses. And then Abhidharma, which is the basket of special or further doctrines. And that's where they analyze human beings to a degree you would not believe. We'll have a little taste of that in the next couple of classes. So we're going to be looking at this, the sutra one, the discourses, as we familiarize ourselves with the early teachings of the Buddha. This Pitaka is arranged into 5 large collections, Nikayas they're called. The first 4 of which feature the Buddha's conversations with people from all walks of life over a 45-year period. So these, I'll just roll up a bit here. 1, 2, 3, 4 are the ones that we'll be focused on most of all. But I should say that's about 5,000 pages of text. Well, think about it, that's many times as much as the Bible or the Quran. Now, there's a fair amount of repetition in there, but still, where did we get the idea that we have no idea what he actually said? The 5th collection is a mixture of sermons, doctrines, and poetry attributed to the Buddha, as well as to some of his disciples. The 5th collection includes 2 famous texts, which we will be quoting from occasionally. One is the Dhammapada, perhaps the most widely read and best known of the scriptures of Buddhism. These sayings of the Buddha are presented in verse form and may be compared loosely with Baha'u'llah's hidden words. The other text is called the Questions of Melinda. And is also highly regarded for its presentation of the Buddha's teachings, this time in the form of a learned dialogue with a Buddhist, a dialogue between a Buddhist sage named Nagasena and the Indo-Greek king Menander I of Bactria, who reigned in the 2nd century before Christ. And this is worth checking if you ever need to quote from some of the writings. Sutta Central Net, Pitaka Sutta, has all of them there for you. So interestingly enough, among the early Buddhist texts of the Pali Canon, there is no continuous life story of the Buddha. These writings concentrated instead on his teachings. It wasn't until later, sometime between 200 before the Common Era and 200 after, that a growing interest in the person of the Buddha led various schools of his followers to produce the first continuous biographies. These drew on scattered accounts in the existing Sutra and Vinaya collections, as well as various oral traditions. Perhaps the most famous of these was Ashvaghosha's poem, The Buddha Karata, which means Actions of the Buddha, which was published in the 2nd century after Christ. Okay, let me just switch down to 6 here. Lori, can I call on you for 6?
The details of these accounts are in general agreement, but while they must clearly be based around historical facts, they also contain legendary and mythological embellishments, and it's often not possible to sort out one from the other. While the bare historical basis of the traditional biography will never be known, as it stands, it gives a great insight into Buddhism by enabling us to see what the meaning of the Buddhist life is to the Buddhists, what lessons it is held to contain. Peter Harvey, An Introduction to Buddhism, Teachings, History, and Practice.
Thank you. The traditional biography does not start with Gautama's birth, but with what went before it. According to the Jataka stories, Gautama lived many lives as a bodhisattva. The word bodhi means enlightenment or awakening or Buddhahood. As an awakening, bodhi is not the awakening of something in the sense of a beginning of something, but a final awakening from delusion or suffering. Thus, a bodhisattva is a being for being, or a being bound for or seeking or directed towards awakening. The tradition holds that 100,000 eons and 4 incalculable periods ago, in one of his past lives, Gautama was an ascetic called Sumedha or Megha, who met and was inspired by a previous Buddha, Dipamkara. As a result of this encounter, he resolved to strive for Buddhahood by becoming a bodhisattva. Sumedha knew that it was possible to become an enlightened disciple of Dipamkara, who was an arhat in that particular life so many eons ago. However, he chose to be a bodhisattva rather than to jump into nirvana all by himself at this point. He took the path to be eventually becoming a perfect Buddha, which would take many lives to complete. As such, he would bring benefit to countless beings by rediscovering and teaching the timeless truths of Dharma in a period when they had been forgotten by the human race. He then spent many lives as a human, as an animal, and as a god, building up the moral and spiritual perfections necessary for Buddhahood. In his penultimate life, the one before his life as Gautama Buddha, he was born in the Tusita heaven, the realm of the delighted gods. This is said to be the same realm where the Bodhisattva Maitreya lives, ready for a future period in human history when Buddhism will have become extinct and he can become the next Buddha. Baha'is equate Maitreya with Baha'u'llah. Interesting. Okay, it is said that Gautama chose the time in human history in which to be born for the last time, with the sutra saying that he was mindful and fully aware when he was conceived in his mother's womb. The Buddha was born in Lumbini in the small kingdom of the Shakya, which straddles the present-day border with Nepal. For this reason, he is known in the later Mahayana Buddhist tradition as Shakya Muni, the Shakyan sage. So let's see if we can find it. Right here, the birthplace of the Buddha, right up in the top is Lumbini in Nepal. Okay, so I think we need to switch back here and we need to see if Heather is online.
Heather is not here this evening, or not yet.
Okay. I know Ingrid is, though. Maybe she could help me.
Yep. Which reading?
Number 7, please.
Number 7.
Yeah.
Near the end of her pregnancy, Gautama's mother, Mahamaya, journeyed from Kapilavatthu to the home of her relatives to give birth, as was the custom. On the way, she and her party passed the pleasant Lumbini Grove, where she stopped to enjoy the flowers and bird song. Here she went into labor and, holding onto a sal tree, gave birth standing up. The sutta accounts say that the baby was set down on the ground by 4 gods, and that a warm and cool stream of water appeared from the sky as a water libation for mother and child. He immediately stood, walked 7 paces, scanned in all directions, and said in a noble voice that he was the foremost being in the world, and that this would be his last rebirth. It's the Buddha in something quoted by Peter Harvey, an introduction to Buddhism.
Thank you. So you can see what Moman was talking about. No, I'm sorry, it was Peter Harvey who was talking about the mixture of what could be considered reality and then the legend. You know, a baby that walks over the ground and then announces to the world who he is. It's just a flight of fancy, really. But anyway, his personal name was Siddharta. His family name was Gautama. His father Suddhodana was the ruler of the Shakyan kingdom. His mother's name was Mahamaya. When she died a week after giving birth to Gautama, he was brought up by his father's second wife, who was Mahayama's sister, Mahaprajapati. Anyway, I'm crucifying the names. I beg your forgiveness, but when you read something and you don't hear anybody else who knows what they're talking about say the names, it's a mess. So later biographies portray Gautama as having been an eager, intelligent, and compassionate youth. His father was apparently keen for him to stay home to become a great king. So he surrounded him with luxuries to make sure he remained attached to the worldly life. According to the custom of the time, he was married at the age of 16 to a beautiful, devoted young princess named Yasodhara, although she was later usually referred to as the mother of Rahula. The young prince lived in his palace with every luxury at his command. The sutras portray his transition from worldly life to religious quest as a gradual process. In their view, Gautama became aware of the facts of aging, sickness, and death in the midst of his sheltered existence. Realizing that he was not immune to the vanities of youth, health, and life, he therefore set out to find the unaging, the unailing, deathless, sorrowless, and undefiled supreme security from bondage, nibbana or nirvana. Nibbana is the Pali version of the Sanskrit word nirvana. Okay, so let's hear what the Buddha has to actually say about it himself. Okay, is Lisa on?
Sorry, sweetie. No, she's not on tonight.
Okay, that's all right. Bill Kelly is though. Maybe you can read numbers 8. So this is
household life is crowded and dusty. Life gone forth into the life of a wandering samana is wide open. It is not easy while living in a home to lead the holy life as utterly perfect and pure as a polished shell. Suppose I shave off my hair and beard, put on a yellow robe, and go forth from the home life into homelessness. The Buddha.
So the later Buddhist traditions say that this crucial transition occurred at the age of 29, just after the birth of his son. In this version, it is portrayed as a sudden realization rather than as the result of a gradually growing understanding. Joey, could you read number 9 for me, please?
On 3 consecutive days, Gautama visited one of his parks in his chariot. His father had had the streets cleared of unpleasant sights, but the gods ensured that he saw an age-worn man, a sick man, and a corpse. He was amazed at these new sights, and his charioteer explained to him the nature of life. In this way, the texts portray an example of the human confrontation with frailty and mortality. For while these facts are known to all of us, the clear realization and acceptance of them often does not come as a novel and disturbing insight. On a fourth trip to his park, Gautama saw a saffron-robed samana with a shaven head and a calm demeanor, the sight of whom inspired him to adopt such a lifestyle. That night, he left his palace, taking a long last look at his son, who lay sleeping in his wife's arms. Knowing it would be difficult for him to leave if she awoke, his renunciation of his family life stands as a symbolic precedent for the monastic life of Buddhist monks and nuns. Peter Harvey.
So in this account, his sudden confrontation with the unpleasant realities of life, disease, old age, and death prompted him to find a solution to these hardships, the way out of this universal suffering. So at the age of 29, soon after the birth of his only child, Rahula, Gautama left his kingdom and became an ascetic in search of this solution. As a samana, he wandered in the valley of the Ganges for 6 years, meeting famous religious teachers, studying and following their systems and methods, and submitting himself to rigorous ascetic practices. So one of the functions of God's messengers seems to me to involve their correction of human misunderstanding of the teachings of their predecessors. In Gautama's case, he took exception to the philosophy of the Brahmins, finding their claims to be unsubstantiated. Okey-dokey, let's see here. I think I saw Danielle. Is she here?
Danielle's here, yeah.
Okay, Danielle. Number 10.
Yeah. Reading 10.
Yes, please.
Gautama too came to deny the doctrine of the saving efficacy of the Vedas and of the ritual observances based on them. And he challenged the claim of the Brahmin priesthood to prescriptive rites in showing the way to salvation. John Noss, Man's Religions.
However, it seems that he was not eager to reject the Brahmin philosophy until he had tested it for himself. Therefore, he sought out teachers from whom he could learn spiritual techniques, going first to a fellow by the name of Alara Kalama. Gautama soon mastered his teachings and then inquired about the meditational state on which they were based. Okay, Jack, let's talk about mysticism here, number 11.
This was the sphere of nothingness, a mystical trance probably attained by yogic concentration, in which the mind goes beyond any apparent object and dwells on nothingness. After Gautama quickly learned to enter this state, Alara offered him joint leadership of his group of disciples. But he turned down the offer as he felt that while he had attained a refined inner calmness, he had not yet attained awakening and the end of suffering.
So Gautama then moved on to another yoga teacher, Uddaka Ramaputra. Once again, he quickly grasped his doctrine and entered the meditational state on which it was based, this time called the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. This went beyond the previous state to a level of mental stilling where consciousness is so attenuated as to hardly exist. But once again, Gautama passed up the opportunity of leadership on the grounds that he had not yet reached his goal. Peter, number 12.
Nevertheless, he had later incorporated both the mystical states he had attained into his own meditational system as possibly ways to calm and purify the mind in preparation for developing liberating insight. He, in fact, taught a great variety of meditational methods, adapting some from the existing yogic tradition, and can be seen as having been one of India's great practitioners of meditation. Peter Harvey, An Introduction to Buddhism.
Thank you. So, after experimenting with one of the methods of religious practice current in his day, i.e. meditation, Gautama went on to try another one, ascetic self-mortification, which Jainism, among other sects, was then advocating. He settled in a woodland grove at Uruvela and resolved to strive to overcome attachment to sensual pleasures by intense effort, trying to dominate such tendencies by force of will. He practiced non-breathing meditations, though they produced fierce headaches, stomach pains, and burning heat all over his body. He reduced his food intake to a few drops of bean soup a day, until he became so emaciated that he could hardly stand and his bodily hair fell out. Here is his own description of his state. Okay, Zil, did you feel like reading again?
Okay. Through feeding on a single cola fruit a day, my body reached a state of extreme emaciation. Because of eating so little, my limbs became like the jointed segments of vine stems or bamboo stems. Because of eating so little, my backside became like a camel's hoof. Because of eating so little, the projections of my spine stood forth like corded beads. Because of eating so little, my ribs jutted out as gaunt as the crazy rafters of an old roofless barn. Because of eating so little, the gleam of my eyes sank far down in a deep well. Because of eating so little, my scalp shriveled and withered as a green, bitter gourd shrivels and withers in the wind and sun. Because of eating so little, my belly skin adhered to my backbone.
So at this point, he felt that it wasn't possible for anyone to go further on the path of asceticism and still live. Although he had developed clarity of mind and energy, his body and mind were pained and untranquil, so that he couldn't carry on his quest. He therefore abandoned his practice of harsh asceticism, which had lasted for 6 years. I think Hangway's there. Could you read this number 14 for us?
For sure. Such extraordinary self-mortification should have produced results if the psychological theory we found him adopting was sound, namely that meditation pursued diligently in a rigorously disciplined body brought one to the goal. But to Gautama's great distress of mind, he was as far from enlightenment as ever.
So once again, here are his own words on the subject. Okay, let's see. How about David Oak? 15.
Sure, gladly do that for you. By this racking practice of austerities, I have not attained my superhuman states, any distinction in knowledge and vision worthy of the noble ones. Could there be another path to enlightenment?
So one day he went down to a stream and fainted dead away. When he returned to consciousness, lying in the shallow water near the bank of the stream, he was sufficiently refreshed in mind and body to begin life anew. Okay, is Linda O'Neill on that?
No, Linda's not here this evening.
Okay, I know Marie is though. That's number 16, please.
Reading 16.
Yes, please.
But though he had returned to common sense, Gautama could not rejoice. 6 years of search along the two most widely recognized roads to salvation known to India, philosophic meditation and bodily asceticism, had yielded no results. But he did not give up the struggle. His thinking now became much more profound and meaningful. John B. Noss, Man's Religions.
Thank you. He might well have abandoned his quest as hopeless, but as we saw in reading number 15, he still thought there might be another way to achieve his goal. Suddenly he remembered a meditative state he had once experienced spontaneously as he sat at the foot of a tree while his father was working.
Mark,
Yes.
Joey has her hand up.
Oh, good. Okay, go ahead, Joey.
Okay, before we get too far and I forget.
Yeah.
We've talked a bit about Gautama being a messenger and referring to God in the singular, but I thought he couldn't be a messenger of God because there were gods, and he didn't see himself as a singular messenger. Am I confused or?
He doesn't seem to talk about it very much, to tell you the truth. I mean, in the Jataka stories that we were seeing at the beginning, some of his lives were spent as gods, but that's a much lesser being than the entity we know as God. It's one of the 6 realms that existence exists on. So, but if there isn't a God, how can he be a messenger from that?
But I thought Buddhists referred to gods versus a single God.
Yes, they do. Many, many, many of them. And they proliferated as time went on. But I have a feeling that if he was asked about it, Abdu'l-Baha would probably talk about these as gods of our imagination, created by our own needs, if you like.
I thought that was one of the conflicts between the Bahai faith and when you speak with Buddhists who see many gods, where a Bahai sees a single God.
Mm-hmm. But they're not on the same playing field, if you like. The Baha'i God is utterly transcendent, whereas these gods are a little closer to the Greek gods more than anything else, as are the Hindu gods.
But would Buddhists themselves see our God as greater than their own gods?
No, they wouldn't accept it at all.
Okay. So you could actually step on a few toes if you, or be quite offensive too.
Yeah. This is one of the big problems in trying to have a conversation with a Buddhist.
Okay.
Where's the commonality here? That's why we have to do a little bit of studying to find out what they actually believe, to then see how we can say things that mean something to them, that are still in alignment with the Baha'i writings.
Right.
There's a fair amount of homework to do, unfortunately, before we can get there. Is that okay?
Do you see that
David or Belinda? I'm not sure which one, or both.
Yeah, Belinda.
I've been attending a yoga class, not the kind where you do asanas and that sort of thing so much. And the very elderly gentleman who conducts this class commented one time that the gods, because these come up in the Bhagavad Gita as well. The gods are divine forces. And he did acknowledge they were personifications. But he was very clear that there is a difference between the gods, as it were, or the divine forces, and whatever else there may be. He didn't go into that very much, but yes, that was his understanding. And he in his commentary, and the commentary he's using as a study base, does draw on some Buddhist teachings from time to time, very respectfully, I might add. So just this gentleman's in his 80s. He was born in Mauritius and comes from a family of yoga practitioners and teachers. So I take what he says as being fairly authentic.
Well, as you're describing his remarks, it makes me think what I'm personally most comfortable doing is conceiving of the gods in Buddhism and Hinduism as the names and attributes of God in Bahai. Just sort of as a starting point.
He says he takes the gods.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody else has been down that road themselves, but I think it's a good way to start at least a conversation.
Okay. I'd like to say something, if I may. But what I want to say is probably further along in the course about Buddha. But you know, you know, when we read in the Revelation of Baha'u'llah, when he goes into, for example, the attributes of God and the way we're supposed to be, you know, with ourselves and with people and with the world and so on, you know, teachings like that very much tie in with the teachings of the Buddha. You know, we're really talking about a different kind of language, completely. And but Baha'u'llah said, he said, all the books are open. That's what he said. He said, now he said, all the books are open and to be examined, every one of them. And that his teachings are for the whole world. Well, how do you reconcile that with Buddhists, you know, and Hindus and so on? Well, we know that there are Baha'is in India, about, I suppose, 3 million or something, or 2 million or whatever it is. And among Buddhists, I don't know. But really, we're talking about an inner world, not an outer world. So that the reality is really from within and not from without. And yet, the Buddha himself, the realizations when they reach nirvana is to go out into the world and to teach the people the Buddhist teachings, and kindness, compassion, and so on. So all these things are just as important as they are in among Baha'is in the Baha'i faith.
That's right.
So,
yeah, there's a lot of similarity when you start getting past the actual words that were used.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I see that Leslie had her hand up momentarily, and then now Jennifer's gone formally with the hand. So let's do it in that order. Leslie first.
Mark, maybe you can clarify for me. I don't quite understand what his goal is here. He was already in the highest realm and a perfect being before he came down. And then he was the foremost being when he landed and stood up after he was born.
Yeah.
And so what's he seeking for if he already has been in the most divine realm? And he already is the foremost being. Eventually his purpose is to teach, but that isn't really what we're hearing when he starts out as a young prince.
Mm-hmm.
What's he looking for?
He is all about helping humanity to overcome suffering. That's his goal. He, I guess, wouldn't have any street cred if he didn't participate in the two avenues that were available to people at that time to gain spiritual enlightenment. One was through the yoga system, and the other was through asceticism. So as I was at some pains to do tonight, I wanted you to see what he went through, that he was very thorough, that he really put those things to a stress test and found that they were wanting. They did not come up with an answer to how to overcome suffering. So that's his life purpose, is to show people through his own example, first of all, but then also to actually teach them techniques where they can become enlightened themselves. And we'll go into some detail about that.
Yeah, but presumably he came to Earth with that knowledge himself before he arrived. But he had to go through the human version of it in order to be able to be an example and teach others?
So, yeah, I think that was part of his teaching method. To show himself, okay, I'm going to do things according to your system, and I'm going to show you that they actually do not bear fruit. Then maybe you'll take me at my word, when I can show you something that actually does get you where you want to go. I think that's what he's about.
Okay.
Okay, Jennifer.
Okay, that may sort of answer the concern that I had, because most of the prophets have received a message, right? Somebody has come, a dove or a burning bush, or like whatever. Mm-hmm. And that's been the time when they sort of, realize who they are or whatever. I mean, this just seemed like such extreme, where he's searching. It didn't seem like anybody was coming and telling him, kind of thing, from the spiritual realm. So, I guess I can see if he's testing things, so that other people will see they don't work. I guess I can understand that. It's just when you read the passage, I thought, my God, somebody who's going to the point, where his body's just about disappearing, and which is not helpful to your mind, right? It actually makes people dull if they don't have enough nutrition. Anyway. I mean, I've read a lot about Buddhism in the past, and I guess I didn't read a lot about this, but that particular quote really sort of turned me back and thinking, doesn't he know who he is? But anyway.
So I guess the thing to think about is that point where he almost died from the asceticism. He finally washed his hands of all of the methods that had been floating around in that environment at that time. And he said, okay, now I'm going to fall back on my own inner resources. I'm going to do it my way. And so at that point, I think the period of time that he had to devote to it was actually fairly short, because he was a gifted meditator, for instance. And what he was doing was going through a series of meditational states, as we'll find out later. And so his enlightenment was coming through those one-on-one experiences that he was having with well, he would say he didn't have a self, but somehow or other he was finding out how to proceed. That's a bit of a mystery, and it's partly because we don't really have a biography. We don't.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I haven't read all of those 5,000 pages yet. So he may actually say something about that, but I haven't found it. Anyway, I don't know if that helps at all or not.
Yeah.
Let's leave it as an open kind of question. Okay, Jack, what's up?
So Mark, this this period of strict asceticism, this is pre-enlightenment? Is this pre the meditation under the Bodhi tree?
Yes.
Okay. Because normally in the pattern of comparative religion, when the prophet receives his revelation, everything changes after that.
Mhm.
So I'll tell you why I'm skeptical about this historical stuff about Buddha. And Mark, you've pointed out that there are mythological elements to the story. We've seen the birth. I think Buddha was cast very much by the priesthood, by the monkhood in the form of a monk. And I think this was a backward projection on his life. Of course, this is only opinion. It's what I'm thinking. I have no evidence to back this up, but I think he was recast very much as a Buddhist monk. Now, I'm not saying I entirely dismiss the whole pre-enlightenment thing of the asceticism and so on and so forth. It's possible, but that's what I'm suspecting. Now, to go back to Leslie's question, Mark, I think you're absolutely right that his religion had a very practical purpose. And the practical purpose of his religion was to relieve suffering. Mm. And you're going to tell us how he did that with the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths and so on. But the correction that he brought, I believe, Leslie, was Hinduism had become so abstract and metaphysical that it was becoming detached from real life. Its philosophical, theological strain, if you like, had become just too dominant. And it was getting detached from the way that a believer should live. So I think Buddha was trying to correct that. So, and in fact, some of the discourses, I don't know if you've picked any of those, Mark, but he criticizes the metaphysical speculation. For example, he says, if a man is shot by an arrow, you don't ask, how fast was the arrow going? Which direction did it come from? What kind of bow was used to shoot the arrow? No, you don't ask those questions. You get the arrow out of the person. So he would, as some of his teaching has come down to us, that he was specifically, he was sort of fed up with metaphysical speculation, and he was trying to get Hinduism back onto a track of, as Baha'is would say, of living the life.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I just finished writing a piece today about that very subject. So it'll appear at least twice in the next 3 lessons. Okay, Lori, what do you got? Oh, you turned yourself off.
Oh.
There you go. Oh, no, now you turned your sound off.
That should be good.
We can't see you, but
oh, where'd you go?
Okay. Sorry.
We can hear you. There
Hey,
you are. Bingo.
hey, look at that.
So I'm a little or a lot confused, but the end of suffering, does that refer to personal or individual suffering, or the suffering of mankind, or of both?
Well, I think the idea is that you take care of yourself first. You put the oxygen mask on yourself first, and then you help those around you.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Okay, so we've got David or Belinda. I'm not sure which was with the question.
Yeah, Belinda.
Hi. I wanted to comment. First of all, I wanted to comment on the birth story, where the mythology. There are lovely mythologies around birth stories. We're all very familiar with the Christmas one. Perhaps less familiar, well, with the birth story of Moses, where his sister set him a boat floating down a river, and he was found by a daughter of the Pharaoh. And then the birth story of Muhammad has quite, that I heard recently, has quite a parallel, because Muhammad was born and immediately assumed a prayer position. And like Buddha, his mother died soon after his birth. His father died before he was born. But that, when I heard the birth story about Buddha, I remembered this other birth story about Muhammad. And he also spoke and said something, I don't remember exactly what, but supposedly it was something actually along the same lines. And so that's an interesting parallel. And but the other thing I wanted to comment on was, Buddha practiced a great deal of asceticism, and somebody was wondering about that. But Jesus went out into the wilderness for 40 days and practiced fasting. 40 days of fasting would be pretty stiff. We just don't have a description of what shape he was in at the end of that. But something important did happen. And Moses spent time in the wilderness. Muhammad spent time practicing in a cave, meditating or praying or whatever, and not presumably stuffing himself full of food at the same time. So I think that what the Buddha was doing at this point in time was quite in line with what we're familiar with, and perhaps a somewhat different context. Oh, and Baha'u'llah, come to think of it.
Yeah.
Spent a couple of years out in the wilderness, and I don't expect he was eating a heck of a lot of food while he was out there. So that's just my comment. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, but
so I'm going to plow forward here because I'm running out of time. Not that we have a lot to cover, but I just like to finish in time. So I was going to ask Jennifer if she wouldn't read number 17. I have to pull that up again, though. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so he remembered this meditative state that he had once experienced spontaneously as he sat at the foot of a tree while his father was working. And now, number 17.
He, Gautama, recognized or recollected that this state, known as the first jhana, was beyond involvement in sense pleasures, which he had been attempting to conquer by painful asceticism, but was accompanied by deep calm, blissful joy, and tranquil happiness. He remembered having wondered whether it was a path to awakening, and as he now saw that it was, he resolved to use it. The above sequence, of course, implies that the two mystical states he had earlier attained were not entered via the jhana, although this became the route to them in the Buddhist meditative system, where they are the top two of four formless arupa attainments. Peter Harvey.
So after accepting food to prepare himself for attaining jhana, his 5 companions in asceticism shunned him in disgust, seeing him as having abandoned their shared quest and taken to luxurious living. Okay, so this is where he sat alone under the Bodhi tree and endured a series of temptations offered to him by a Satan-like figure known as Mara. a deity who had won his place by previous good works, but who uses his power to entrap people in sensual desire and attachment, so as to stay within his realm of influence. Mara urged Gautama to abandon his quest and take up a more conventional religious life of sacrifice and good works in order to generate good karma. So let's see what he had to say about that particular idea. How about Linda Russell? Number 18.
Reading 18. Gautama replied that he had no need of more good karma and scorned the squadrons of Mara, sense desire, jealousy, hunger and thirst, craving, dullness and lethargy, cowardice, fear of commitment, belittling others, obstinate insensitivity, and self-praise. Peter Harvey, An Introduction to Buddhism.
So,
Can I just say, obstinate sensitivity is an interesting choice.
How do you mean?
I just haven't seen it put that way before. So we're thinking about.
So that's sort of the opposite of what he was going to teach, which was compassion, which is very open, very sensitive to other people around you, right? Anyway, so Gautama remained rooted to his chosen spot and meditated on the spiritual perfections he had developed over many previous lives. He then touched the earth for it to bear witness to the good karma he had generated in past lives. The earth quaked and the earth goddess appeared, wringing from her hair a flood of water, accumulated in the past when Gautama had formalized good deeds by a simple ritual of water pouring. At the quaking and the flood, Mara and his army fled. This conquest of Mara is commemorated as a victory over evil by countless images and paintings. These show Gautama sitting cross-legged in meditation with his right hand touching the earth, like this one. You'll see that over and over and over again in the statues and in the paintings. The idea of the earth goddess acting as witness to Gautama's perfections is suggestive of the spiritual need to be mindfully connected to the earth. In his spiritual quest, it is worth noting that Gautama turned to a path of mindful awareness of the body, especially breathing, to induce meditation, rather than not attending to the physical in formless states or trying to forcefully repress the body and its needs in a painful, ascetic way. This was a big difference in his system compared to those around him. In contrast with Jainism, which fixed its whole hope on an uncompromising and extreme asceticism, Gautama found deliverance in a moderate and common sense middle way. To him, extreme asceticism did not make sense, any more than sensuality did. They did not satisfy him, so he abandoned all traditional religions and their methods to pursue his own path. Okay, let's go back here. We're almost done. Let me see. Is Eva on tonight?
Sorry,
Nope.
no, she's not tonight.
Okay, then I guess it's Nina's turn. Number 19, please.
Sure. Coolly and objectively, Gautama, had tested every way of salvation offered by the teachers and spiritual leaders of his time, and refused to be swept away into any vagary of religious behavior, however logically self-consistent. John B. Noss, Man's Religions.
So free from sensual and spiritual hindrances, Gautama then developed deep meditations as a prelude to his awakening, sitting under a species of tree that later became known as the Bodhi or awakening tree. The account in the Majjhima Nikaya describes how he went into the first stage of meditation and then gradually deepened his state of concentrated calm until he reached the fourth state, a state of great equanimity, mental brightness, and purity. I'm hoping Sherry was willing to read this one, number 20.
Based on this state, he, Gautama, went on to develop in the course of 3 watches of the moonlit night, the threefold knowledge, memory of many of his countless previous lives, seeing the rebirth of others according to their karma, and knowing the destruction of the asavas, spiritual taints or cankers which fester in the mind and keep it unawakened. The third knowledge, completed at dawn, brought the perfect awakening he had been seeking, so that he was now, at the age of 35, a Buddha, with joyful direct experience of the unconditioned nirvana beyond aging, sickness, and death. And Peter Harvey, An Introduction to Buddhism.
So from that point onward, he was known as the Buddha, the enlightened one. His full name was thus Siddharta Gautama Shakyamuni Buddha. And that's where we're going to leave it tonight, just before he starts teaching. Okay, so this was a lot less challenging, I think, than the previous class in terms of our comfort level with religion. But anyway, we've broken the ground. We're now engaged in studying Buddhism. Any thoughts, any comments, any questions? The floor is open. Oh, Joey's got her hand up. Yes.
Did he retain any elements of asceticism?
Moderate ones.
Because anytime you sort of look him up for a just quick, who was Buddha, they always refer to him as an ascetic.
Well, they may have been talking about that period that we described tonight, but after that, I don't think he was involved in it particularly.
I just found that the general reference, if you type it into Google, and many of the references there refer to him as an ascetic versus the complete evolution of who he was.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think as Jack said earlier, he was a very practical person. He was looking for practical solutions to people's real world issues. And about that 5,000 pages that I was mentioning are really devoted to the conversations he had with people at all kinds of different levels, depending on where they were on the spectrum, as what their problems were and how to actually address them. And from that, then we can cobble together a system, if you like, that can be applied to just about anybody under any circumstances. But it was very practical. And asceticism did not play a big part in Buddhism, really. There were still a lot of monks who decided that it was best for them at the particular period in their lives to go out and do a retreat for X number of months or years. So I guess they were ascetic, but it was just as common for people to become enlightened when they were family members, interacting with people in their businesses and all the rest of it. So it wasn't exclusively focused on the monkish side of things. Okay. Okay, Jack, what's your question or observation?
Well, I want to go back to my theory that the Buddha was cast as a monk. And I mean, what Joey is saying sort of substantiates that, although Mark, you're pointing out that in the post-enlightenment stage, he de-emphasized asceticism. So we can say that asceticism belonged to the pre-enlightenment stage, if you like, which he rejected. But nonetheless, Buddha, I mean, and even based on some of the readings that you've selected for tonight, he's cast in the form of a meditator. And that is a very monkish concept. That's what monks do. They meditate. They study the scriptures. They're not out there in society, you know, changing society necessarily. They're a close community. So, I mean, for me, in Buddha, if you compare him to the other prophets of God, they're not, I mean, it is a different tradition. I understand that, the Abrahamic religions and Hinduism and Buddhism. In the Abrahamic traditions, the prophets are not cast essentially as meditators. They go through a meditative period, you know, Jesus fasting in the desert, Baha'u'llah and Suleimani and so on. Incidentally, in the case of Baha'u'llah, there's no temptation stories going on there at all. The only temptation he had was that he didn't want to go back, and he was very clear that he accepted the directions of the Holy Spirit and the angel Gabriel who directed him to go back. So he had to go on, continue with his mission. Anyway, that's just a few thoughts there for what they're worth.
So, Jack, once he attained enlightenment, he didn't need to meditate anymore. He'd arrived. He was beyond all that now. So
maybe
he pursued
Mark,
his life.
But the point is that meditation remains very central to
True.
Buddhism.
Yes, it does.
More than any other religion, perhaps.
Yep.
And what I'm suspecting is that is part of the backward monkish projection. I mean, look at the statue of Buddha. He was from India, for heaven's sakes. He didn't look like somebody who was from the Far East. He didn't look like a Chinese or a Japanese. He was an Indian. So people, I mean, they tend to mold their founder in their own image to some extent.
Absolutely.
You know? Anyway.
So that's why I put all the caveats around the biography, the statements that we made tonight about we really have no idea what the true story was.
Right.
We really don't.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that.
And what we have is so mythological that, geez, I don't know if you can tease any pieces of reality out of it. So to me, it doesn't really matter. But the point that I think it was Peter Harvey made was that it's a nice window into the way Buddhists think about their religion and their founder. That's useful. But whether it's true or not, I don't know. We never will decide that.
Well, what has a ring of truth for me, Mark, is seeing the old age, sickness, and death. That to me has a strong ring of truth, because as an aristocrat, Buddha would have been protected largely from those things. And that was when he saw the corpse, the old man, and the afflicted individual. That was a life-altering experience for him. It obviously had a very profound effect on his conscience, life-altering effect on his conscience. So that particular aspect has a strong ring of truth for me. It may have happened, it may not, I don't know, but it certainly would explain part of the evolution of his spiritual consciousness and how it changed.
Okay.
Couple of hands up, Mark. I guess you've.
Jennifer is
Jennifer,
next, and then David or Belinda.
And then Leslie.
Oh, I didn't see Leslie. Okay.
Just wanted to point out that women often get the short end of the stick, okay? Because the story starts with, you know, his wife has a baby and he leaves. You know, like, you know, Rumi left his wife to go on, like a number of them just take off to be spiritual figures. And, you know, I appreciate that the Buddha learned many different things, but he just, you know, up and left. Anyway.
Yeah, I have that reaction too. I really do. And they die a week after childbirth. You know, anyway.
You know, like religions are not kind to us traditionally. Yeah. I mean, even you know, Baha'u'llah left, he up and left, right? And didn't tell his wife or anybody what he was doing, and went off for a couple of years. So I don't know, somehow, anyway, women do get the short end of the stick.
Thank you, Jennifer.
I think it's politically correct for me not to say a thing. Okay, so let's move on then to Belinda or David, I'm not sure who. And then we'll remember Leslie.
And Leslie and then Margaret.
And we've only got 5 minutes.
Okay. But I do agree, you know, that women have gotten the short end of the stick. Abdu'l-Baha, if I recall, he was asked about the religions of the East. And once again, if I recall rightly or not, I don't know, but he said that the religions of the East, you know, they're from another tradition or another line of manifestations of God. And he said that in certain respects, their teachings were more advanced than those of the Western religions.
Yeah.
I didn't exactly say it in that way, but like that anyway. And you know, it once again, you know, what we have, I think, to understand is the inner teachings of Buddha. I mean, look, if you look at, you know, the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita, I mean, here you're looking at what we would call mysticism. And I think many of us don't even know what that is. We think we do, but most don't know what that is. But if we all, for example, were realized the inner truth or inner reality of ourselves, this would have a tremendous effect on the external world, not only of ourselves, but of the whole universe. So, and that leads to something else, which is basically that, you know, there is a metaphysical and even cosmological, a very important element in Buddhism. And it's very, very important, but that's another thing. Okay.
My turn.
Belinda wants to say something.
I wanted
and
to
we got to
say
get
that-
Leslie in here too. So
Okay, I'll be quick. I wanted to say that the emphasis on meditation, especially when Buddhism is presented in a Western context, North America, there is a lot of emphasis on the meditation. That's not necessarily how Buddhists live in a Buddhist country. They do all the stuff we do. They run businesses, they do this, they do that.
Sure.
They have prayer practices and ceremonies and things like that. So we have to remember that we're seeing Buddhism often through a Western lens. And
Right.
that lens has sometimes been distorted already to let us see certain aspects and not others. which is why maybe Joey gets these funny things on Google.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh. Okay, now Leslie, what are you going to ask here?
Well, I'm coming back to part of my other question. If he was, we see him as a manifestation coming from a world above where he was one of all the manifestations and all of the knowledge, why did he have to learn all this stuff on earth? I mean, we don't think of Baha'u'llah as learning this stuff on earth. He was born as a wealthy person and somehow he knew this. He knew about suffering. He already had this learning. It was revealed that he was the person to teach us, to him in his prison, but he had this innate knowledge. And we also talk about Jesus having innate knowledge and Muhammad having innate knowledge. They didn't have to go through all these steps of, extreme fasting and suffering in order to overcome and have this enlightened moment so they could then teach people. Like he came with a purpose to teach people, as you said, but if he didn't know what he was going to teach, I'm just having difficulty of seeing where he is a manifestation of the same kind we're talking about.
Well, I think it's true, though, in both the case of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, that they only gradually revealed who they really were over a long period of time. Well, not so long in the Bab's case. But he didn't dare come out at the beginning of his revelation and say, look, I'm a new manifestation of God on par with all the others. He wouldn't have had a single follower. He would have been killed immediately for blasphemy. So he parceled out the information over a period of time, 5 years or so, where he made slightly larger claims as to who he was. First, he was an emissary from the 12th hidden Imam, and then he actually said that he was sort of the return of that Imam, etc. And then he warmed people up to the idea that he was in fact a manifestation. And Baha'u'llah did much the same thing. If you look at it, he didn't proclaim to everybody in Baghdad that he was a new manifestation, that he was the one that the Bab had been talking about. He only said that to his very closest family and friends. It wasn't until he got to Adrianople that he started proclaiming himself in his new role to the leaders of the world, for instance. So there was a gradual unfoldment. And Baha'u'llah makes the point that the sun doesn't dare come up in its fullness right after the dark, because it would fry everything, right? People are not capable of taking that much light in all at once. They have to become accustomed to it. So that's what I think the Buddha is doing in his circumstances, is accustoming everybody to his being somebody that they can respect as having brought a new system. He found a new way to overcome suffering that nobody had known about before. And they wouldn't have paid any attention to him unless he had proved himself a master of the techniques that were visible or available to him in his environment.
So he actually knew that to begin with, but he had to go through it physically.
That would be my suspicion. Yeah. It's all about how he was being perceived by people around him. Would they listen to him if he just came out as a nobody and said all these things? Probably not. Anyway, that's how it makes sense to me. I don't know. I haven't even seen that written anywhere, but that's how it makes sense to me. Okay, Margaret, you have the last word.
I'm just thinking that everybody is a person of their time. And if the Buddha was around at 400 BCE, he was around at a time when, women have not been equal. I don't know of any of the great religions other than the Bahai faith that says men and women are equal.
Fair enough.
And if you're living in any other era with the brutality of some of the things that went on in those eras, with disease, war, the lack of respect for human life, I think the Buddha walked away from his family. Well, that doesn't particularly afflict me. And what he went through as a person of his day, he went through, I think, he was a prince who was protected from things, and then he took on a different life and explored that life with some of the customs and some of the things that were going on in his day. I'm not at all strained to listen to what was going on and how he approached various things. I'm interested, but and the fact that we don't have the details. So you've got these layers and layers of human accretion to that. So the mythologies and the people that think this. I mean, because my daughter's in Thailand, we go over there and you've got the temples and the monks going around. And as Jack said, the monks' life is a very masculine life. They're all over the place with their robes. I can't touch them. If they touch me as a female, it's sort of defiling. So I have to be very careful on their subways and things, not to get too close.
But that being said, though, the Buddha also instituted the institution of the nuns during his lifetime, which is rather unusual for a religion. So they had prestige, they had power of their own. And there are some very famous yoginis and dakinis throughout Buddhist history. So it's not exclusively masculine.
Sure. I mean, there's some Christian nuns and some early Christian women that held a prominent position as well. So there's a bit of rise and fall, but
yeah.
Anyway.
Well, on that down note, I guess, are we finished, or are there any lingering questions or comments to make? Yes, Jennifer.
I just wanted to say that I don't think what the Buddha came to, I don't think that culture was as brutal as, for instance, the one that Muhammad came to. So I would sort of dispute whether it was really brutal in terms of women or whatever at that time. From what I understand, it was a more civilized culture than some.
But that was still a society that was still a society where women were expected to throw themselves on their husband's funeral pyre because nobody could take care of them.
Yeah.
So that was, what can I say?
Just if you go after suffering and you leave your wife suffering, I guess that's one way she can find out suffering, but anyway.
Yeah.
Little levity there.
Yeah. Well, I just wrote in the chat that Baha'u'llah came back to his wife and family. But according to Buddhism, Buddha didn't. And of course, that would be consistent with.
But he did teach both of them.
No. In part of the story, it is true. His wife at first was very angry with Buddha because he left. And later on, they met again. And the Buddha showered gifts upon her. He was very loving towards her. And he understood how she felt. So I don't know what in terms of his own family, children and whatnot, I don't know. But his wife then became his follower.
Okay.
She ended up following him.
Also, when he left, he knew very well that she and his child would be well looked after.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll forgive him.
I think that would be a very good idea.
Oh, thank God.
Mark, I just want,
Jennifer, you have a grudge.
Yeah. No, women get the short end of the stick. Let's face it, Buddhist monks are not even supposed to touch women in any way. But anyway, I just want to make a quick comment on Leslie's question, which I think is a very good one. And the way to reconcile it, I think, is you look at the Bodhi tree as the moment when the revelation descended on the Buddha. We don't know what his consciousness was prior to the Bodhi tree. We have no idea, but he's been cast as a monkish individual who tried these different things and then rejected them ultimately. But so conceivably, if that took place before the revelation descended on him, then he was pretty much following the dictates of his own conscience, as any other manifestation of God would have been until the Siya Chal moment happened, you know? So who knows? I don't think I'm not sure if it was severe as it's presented to be. I've got my suspicions about that he almost starved himself to death. Is that a reasonable thing for a human being to do, especially one who's destined to become a manifestation of God? I don't think so.
He showed that it wasn't right.
The Bodhi tree, you know,
Here we go.
I myself, it's a personal thing. I liken the Bodhi tree to the Lok tree in the Bahai faith.
Yeah.
A tree beyond which there is no passing. And you can't go past.
We can't.
We can't go past the reality and the knowledge of the manifestation of God. So, you know, and the whole trees are very important in the Baha'i faith, as you know. There's a tremendous symbolism in that. So, you know, so that for me, the Bodhi tree is very, very significant.
Well, folks, I'm going to call it a night. I don't know what you did. I find it, I'm tired at the end of a session.
Thank you, Mark.
Amy, more tired tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you, Mark.
Good night, everybody.
Linda.